The grease was already popping when you walked in, and the whole place smelled like hot coffee, pickled brine, and something frying you couldn't name but wanted immediately. Gas stations in the 1970s fed America one road trip at a time. Here are 30 gas station foods that were actually delicious. Stewart Sandwiches were the first hot meal most gas stations ever served. A franchise operation out of Bloomington, Minnesota, started by Earl Sween in 1955, delivered frozen sandwiches to stations across the Midwest, along with a chrome countertop oven that heated them in minutes. The torpedo, the chuck wagon, the twin chili dog, each wrapped in foil, each punched into the machine by number. You stood watching through the little glass window while the bread crisped and the cheese melted, and for under $1 you had something hot that felt like a real meal. The sandwiches were simple: ground beef with brown gravy, processed cheese on a soft roll, but they were warm, and they tasted like the road itself. By the time Amana Radarange microwaves replaced those chrome ovens in the late 1970s, the original Stewart setup had already vanished from most counters. Nobody ever figured out how to make that torpedo taste the same in a microwave. The jar sat on the counter like it had been there since the station opened. Cloudy brine, pale eggs bobbing in vinegar, a handwritten sign taped to the glass that said 50 cents. You never asked how long they'd been sitting there. That was the unwritten rule. You reached in with your fingers or a pair of tongs, ate it standing up by the register with a sprinkle of salt and a dash of hot sauce. The brine was different everywhere. Some stations used beet juice that turned the eggs deep red, others used jalapeno and garlic that made your eyes water. The best ones came from stations where the owner's wife made the brine herself, a recipe she kept in her head and never wrote down. Those jars are mostly gone now, replaced by plastic-wrapped protein packs in refrigerated cases. The eggs are cleaner. They're also forgettable. Before Planters owned the shelf, Tom's owned the gas station. Tom Houston started roasting peanuts in Columbus, Georgia in 1925, selling them in narrow glassine bags he patented himself, a nickel a bag, salted and cooked in coconut oil at 350 degrees until they cracked just right. By the 1970s, that red triangular logo hung on wire racks in filling stations across the South, and the Tom's man, the independent distributor who restocked the rack every week, was as regular as the fuel truck. You grabbed a bag and a cold drink, and that was lunch. The salt hit first, then the oil, then the deep, roasted flavor no other brand could match. Houston himself had lost the company to the bank by the 30s, but his name kept feeding people for 50 years. The racks are thinner now, the glassine bags replaced by foil and corporate logos. But if you grew up reaching for that red triangle, you still remember the way the salt stuck to your fingers. They hung from a cardboard display near the register like dried meat wind chimes, rows of Slim Jims in red and yellow wrappers, a quarter apiece. You peeled back the plastic, cracked through the outer casing, and the rush of salt, smoke, and pepper hit the back of your throat before you even started chewing. The original sticks were thinner than what you find today, leaner, drier, with a sharper pepper bite that sat on your tongue for miles. Kids ate them in the back seat. Truckers kept a handful in the cab. Nobody read the ingredients, and nobody cared. Beef, mechanically separated chicken, corn syrup, paprika, and enough sodium nitrite to keep the stick shelf-stable for what felt like forever. You chewed while the highway stretched in front of you, and the stick lasted longer than most conversations. The display rack is still there in most stations, but the sticks are bigger now, sweeter, softer. That original snap when you bit through the casing, that's what disappeared. If the pickled eggs were a quiet dare, the pickled sausages were a full commitment. They sat in gallon jars behind the counter, fat, pink links floating in spiced vinegar, sometimes dyed red from cayenne. Penrose was the brand you saw most often, but in Louisiana, regional operations like Big Mama ran the counter with family recipes that never left the parish. You pulled one out with tongs, let it drip, and bit through the casing right there at the register. The vinegar hit first, sharp and clean, then the smoke, then a slow heat that built in the back of your jaw. Old-timers paired them with saltines. The men who ate them regularly, mechanics, farmers, long-haul drivers, never flinched. They'd eat too, wipe their hands on their jeans, and get back to work. That jar is a rare sight now, mostly surviving in small-town stations across the Deep South, where the counter still smells like brine and black pepper. In the South, you didn't ask for peanut butter crackers, you asked for Nabs. The word became shorthand for any pack of sandwich crackers in cellophane, but the original Nabs came from Lance, Incorporated out of Charlotte, North Carolina, peanut butter between crackers since 1913. By the 70s, the orange Lance rack was bolted to the wall of every gas station below Virginia, stocked with toast crackers, cheese crackers, and the cream-filled cookies kids went for first. A pack cost a dime, maybe 15 cents. Your father kept a pack in the glove box. Your uncle kept one in his toolbox. The Lance man who restocked the rack drove a panel van and knew every station owner by name. He was part of the rhythm of the week, as expected as the mail. Those racks still exist in pockets of the South, but the company merged, the branding changed, and the packs cost more now than a gallon of gas did then. The word Nabs, though, that hasn't gone anywhere. The can was small enough to fit in a coat pocket, and that was the whole point. Vienna Sausages, stubby, pale links packed in broth under a pull-tab lid, were survival food dressed up as a snack. Armor was the brand most stations carried, stacked between the sardines and the potted meat, 3 for $1. You peeled back the lid, drained the broth into the trash, and ate them cold with your fingers, standing in the parking lot or sitting on the tailgate. No plate, no fork, no pretense. The taste was salty and soft, vaguely smoky, with a texture people either loved without apology or couldn't stomach. There was no middle ground. Construction workers carried them in lunch pails. Fishermen kept a flat in the tackle box. They required nothing, no heat, no refrigeration, and they filled the gap when the next diner was 40 miles away, and the only stop was a 2-pump station with a tin roof. The bag crinkled before you even opened it, and the smell hit the whole car. Salt, pork fat, and something deep-fried that had no business being that good. Pork rinds were southern to their bones, born from hog-killing traditions that turned every part of the pig into something useful. The skin was scraped, dried, and fried until it puffed into crisp, airy curls that dissolved on your tongue and left grease on your fingertips. Gas stations carried them on the rack next to the chips, cellophane bags from Tom's or Golden Flake, whatever regional brand ran the route. A bag cost less than a quarter. Mexican-American families along the border knew them as chicharrones and fried them fresh with lime and chili powder, a completely different experience from the bagged version. But the gas station bag was its own kind of perfect. You ate them by the handful between towns, licked the salt off your fingers, and crumpled the empty bag under the seat. Eating sunflower seeds on a road trip was less about hunger and more about having something to do with your mouth for 300 miles. The ritual was everything. Crack the shell with your front teeth, work the seed out with your tongue, spit the hull into a paper cup wedged between your legs. David Brand was the name on most bags, though regional roasters showed up too. Darker or saltier depending on where you were. A bag cost 15 cents and lasted longer than any other snack in the station because you couldn't rush the process. Long-distance drivers turned seed cracking into a survival technique. The constant motion kept you awake on night drives when the radio faded to static. Your father could crack and spit without taking his eyes off the road, the hull shooting out the cracked window like a reflex. You tried to learn. You swallowed as many shells as you spit for the first year. Nobody taught you. You watched and tried until your teeth knew the motion on their own. Before Jack Link's put jerky in every checkout aisle, the jerky at a gas station was local. It came in hand-labeled bags or brown paper sacks, dried in somebody's smokehouse, and the brand was often just a name, Ray's or Big Jim's or a surname in a town you'd never heard of. The strips were darker, tougher, and saltier than anything mass-produced, with smoke that varied station to station because every recipe was different. Some used soy and garlic. Some used nothing but salt and hickory. A few added red pepper flakes that caught you two chews in. Stations in Wyoming, Montana, and the rural South kept the best stock, often made by the same family for decades. You held the strip in your teeth and tore, and the flavor released slow, the way good jerky should. Those hand-labeled bags are nearly extinct. Food safety regulations and corporate distribution pushed the small batch makers off the rack and replaced them with vacuum-sealed packages that taste like teriyaki-flavored leather. But if the jerky fed the body, moon pies fed something else entirely. That round, foil-wrapped disc of marshmallow and graham cracker dipped in chocolate that the Chattanooga bakery had been making since 1917. By the 70s, they were the unofficial currency of Southern gas stations, stacked by the register, a quarter apiece. The story went that a salesman asked coal miners in Kentucky what kind of snack they wanted, and they said something filling, round as the moon. What made a moon pie from a gas station different was the context. You ate it leaning against the car in a gravel lot, the chocolate coating slightly soft from sitting in the heat. The marshmallow stretched when you pulled the halves apart, and the crumbs fell on your shirt in a way that felt like part of the ritual. Your grandfather bought them by the box. The bakery in Chattanooga still runs, but the stations that sold them one at a time, warm from the sun. Those are the ones that made a moon pie mean something. She grabbed 2 from the rack without looking, cherry for herself, lemon for you, and dropped them on the counter next to the gas money. Hostess fruit pies hung from wire clips in every gas station in the 1970s, their glazed crusts visible through the cellophane. Cherry, apple, blueberry, lemon. The filling was thick and sweet, the crust fried to a crackle that shattered when you bit through and sent flakes down your shirt. They cost 35 cents. The pies ran in comic book ads next to superheroes, and every kid knew what they looked like before tasting one. But the ones you remember came from that stop on the long drive to your grandmother's house, eaten in the back seat with sticky fingers while your parents argued over the map. The crust was different then, greasier, heavier, fried in a way that left a film on the roof of your mouth. Hostess still makes them, but they bake the crust now. Whatever oil they used is gone, and with it, that exact crunch that meant you were almost there. Potted meat cost less than anything else on the shelf, and it fed you when nothing else would. The small flat can, Armour or Libby's, sometimes a no-name brand with a label peeling at the edges, held a paste of ground beef, pork, and mechanically separated chicken blended smooth enough to spread on saltines with the edge of the lid. The taste was salty, faintly metallic, and familiar to anyone who'd worked a 12-hour shift and needed calories without ceremony. Truckers kept a stack in the cab. It cost 19 cents in the early 1970s, and a can with a sleeve of crackers was a full meal for a man who couldn't afford the diner down the road. Underwood's deviled ham ran the same shelf, the oldest trademarked food in America, stamped with a red devil since 1868. And the argument over which spread was better could keep a counter occupied for an hour. Nobody buys potted meat to impress anyone. That was never the point. The tin key was half the ritual. You peeled back the metal lid in a slow curl, and the oil rose up, dense, fishy, sharp, and everybody in the car knew what you'd opened. Sardines packed in mustard sauce or soybean oil sat on gas station shelves next to the Vienna Sausages, and the men who ate them did so without apology. You laid them on saltines one at a time, bones and all, and ate them in the parking lot because nobody wanted that smell in the vehicle. A tin and crackers cost under 50 cents and delivered more protein per dollar than anything behind the counter. Old fishermen swore by the mustard-packed ones. Mechanics preferred the oil. The bones were soft enough to chew through, and if that bothered you, you weren't the audience. Sardines were immigrant food turned working-class fuel, Portuguese, Scandinavian, Southern, and the gas station was the last place they held ground before grocery stores pushed them to the bottom shelf and polite company pushed them out of sight. If sardines were the stoic man's lunch, Beanie Weenies were the grinning kid's treasure. Van Camp's small can of pork and beans studded with cocktail-sized franks, eaten cold with a plastic spoon or straight from the can with a tilt and a prayer. The beans were sweet, the franks were soft, and together they tasted like a backyard cookout crammed into something that fit in a coat pocket. Gas stations stacked them near the register, and on road trips in the 1970s, A can of Beanie Weenies was the compromise between the driver who wanted to keep moving and the kid in the back who wanted to stop for a real meal. You didn't heat them. You didn't plate them. You sat on the curb outside the station and ate them with the can balanced on your knee while the gas pumped itself. That can, though, when you see one now, it hits different. You're not thinking about the beans. You're thinking about the curb, the heat rising off the asphalt, and the person who handed you the spoon. Nobody remembers the first one they ate, but everybody remembers the smell. That rotating carousel of hot dogs under a heat lamp, the casings glistening with grease, the buns sitting in a warmer that may or may not have been turned on. Before 7-Eleven introduced the Big Bite in the late 1980s, gas station hot dogs were simpler, speared on metal prongs or rolling slowly on chrome bars, cooked for hours, sometimes all day. The ones that had been there since morning got dark and tight-skinned, and the regulars knew that was when they tasted best. You loaded them yourself from a condiment tray, yellow mustard, sweet relish, raw onions if the station kept them, and you ate them in the car with a napkin tucked into your collar because the bun always fell apart by the third bite. A hot dog and a fountain drink cost less than $1. You didn't ask what was in them. You just asked the kid behind the counter when they were put on, and if he said morning, you grabbed 2. The microwave changed everything, and the gas station burrito was proof. When countertop microwaves started appearing in stations in the mid-1970s, the frozen burrito was one of the first things thrown inside, a tight roll of tortilla, refried beans, and processed cheese that went from frozen to scalding in 90 seconds. El Monterey and store-brand versions filled the freezer case, wrapped in plastic, priced at $2 for $1. The outside was always too hot, and the center always still cold. You learned to let it sit for a minute, but you never did. You bit in too soon, burned the roof of your mouth, and ate the rest anyway because you were hungry and the road was long. The tortilla went rubbery in the microwave, the cheese congealed into an orange stripe down the middle, and none of that mattered. It was hot, it was filling, and it was ready before you finished paying for gas. The microwave turned the gas station into a kitchen, and the frozen burrito was its first real meal. You could hear someone eating corn nuts from 3 aisles away, that jaw-cracking, tooth-rattling crunch that sounded like gravel in a blender. The bag was small, the kernels hard as river rocks, and the salt aggressive enough to sting your lips after a handful. Albert Holloway invented them in 1936 in Oakland, California, deep-frying giant corn kernels until they turned into something between a chip and a geological sample. By the 70s, they hung from gas station racks in barbecue, ranch, and original, and they were the snack people either worshipped or refused to touch. There was no casual relationship with corn nuts. You committed. Your jaw ached after the bag was empty. The crunch was so loud you couldn't eat them during a conversation without the other person stopping to stare. Kids dared each other to eat them fast. Adults paced themselves and still ended up with sore molars by the end of the drive. They're still on the rack. They're still that loud. It wasn't a meal. It was a statement. An RC Cola and a moon pie together cost less than 50 cents in the 1970s, and in the rural South, that combination was lunch for mill workers, field hands, and anyone who had 30 minutes and not much money. Royal Crown Cola had always run cheaper than Coca-Cola, and that price gap made it the working man's drink, the one you grabbed from the gas station cooler because it stretched the budget. Paired with a moon pie, it was sweet enough to feel like a reward and filling enough to get you to supper. Country songs were written about it. Church picnics served it. The combination became so embedded in Southern identity that towns held festivals around it. The RC Cola and Moon Pie Festival in Bell Buckle, Tennessee, still draws thousands every June. Your granddaddy didn't call it a tradition. He called it Tuesday. And when he was gone, you couldn't drink an RC without hearing him pop the cap on the bottle opener bolted to the side of the cooler. Some stations kept a crock pot behind the counter, and if you knew to ask, you could get a styrofoam cup of chili for 75 cents. Thick, dark, simmered since dawn, ladled out by the owner's wife or the attendant who'd been there since the station opened. This wasn't advertised. There was no menu board. You either knew or you didn't, and the regulars always knew. The chili was different at every station. Some used ground beef and kidney beans. Others went all meat with cumin and chili powder so heavy the spoon stood up in the cup. You crumbled saltines on top, ate it at the counter or in your truck, and the warmth sat in your chest all afternoon. Those stations existed in the spaces between interstates, two-pump operations on state highways where the owner pumped your gas and knew your name. When the self-serve revolution hit and the chains moved in, the crock pot went home. The chili recipe went with the woman who made it, and nobody who came after her ever thought to ask. The cellophane was already sticky before you opened it, that glazed spiral of sweet dough that passed for breakfast when you were running late and the gas station was the only thing open. Honey buns sat on the snack rack between the powdered donuts and the oatmeal creme pies, priced at $0.25 or less, and they were the first thing shift workers grabbed at 5 in the morning on the way to the plant. Mrs. Baird's made them in Texas. Little Debbie made them in Tennessee. Tasty Cake ran the Northeast. Every region had its brand, and every brand had its loyalists who swore theirs was softer, sweeter, or had more glaze. The dough was dense and pulled apart in layers. The glaze cracked under your teeth and the whole thing was gone in 4 bites, barely enough to count as food, but enough sugar to get you through the first 2 hours of a shift. Your mother never would have called it breakfast. Your father ate one every morning without saying a word about it. The kettle sat outside the station, sometimes on a folding table, sometimes on the tailgate of a truck. A deep pot of salted water with raw peanuts boiling until the shells went soft and the nuts inside turned creamy and swollen. Boiled peanuts were a low-country and deep South tradition that spread through gas stations along rural highways from the Carolinas to the Gulf Coast, sold in brown paper bags soaked through with brine, $1 for a generous scoop. The Cajun version added cayenne and crab boil seasoning to the water, enough heat to make your nose run. You cracked the warm shell with your teeth, sucked the salty liquid out, and ate the soft peanut inside. The texture surprised everyone who tried it for the first time. Nothing like a roasted peanut, closer to a cooked bean, wet and earthy, and unlike anything else at the station. If you grew up eating them, you couldn't explain the appeal to someone who didn't. You just handed them the bag and waited for the look on their face. The bottle was already sweating when you pulled it from the cooler. That thick glass curve of Nehi grape soda, so purple it almost looked black, cold enough to sting your palm. Royal Crown bottling made Nehi in a dozen flavors, but grape was the one that mattered in the 1970s, especially in the South, where gas station coolers kept it stocked next to the RC Cola and the Orange Crush. The sweetness was aggressive. Not fruit, but something closer to candy dissolved in ice water, and the color stained your tongue a shade of violet that didn't wash off for hours. Kids wore it like proof. You drank it in the parking lot, the glass warm by the last sip, and set the empty bottle in the wooden crate by the door for the deposit. That crate is gone. The glass bottles are gone. Nehi still exists in cans on a few shelves, but the grape that turned your mouth purple and came in a bottle heavy enough to use as a doorstop, that faded with the coolers that held it. The jars were lined up by the register like an apothecary. Glass lids, hand-lettered prices, each one holding a different world. Atomic fireballs, root beer barrels, Bit-O honey, Mary Janes, butterscotch discs, peppermint sticks, and the wax bottles filled with colored syrup that you bit the top off and drank in one tilt. A penny bought one piece, a nickel bought a handful. Gas stations in the 1970s kept those jars on the counter because every parent paying for fuel had a kid standing right there, staring. You pointed. The attendant reached in. The whole transaction bought 30 minutes of silence in the back seat. The candy itself was ancient. Some recipes dated to the 1800s, but the ritual felt new every time. The jars faded when pre-packaged candy took over, and with them went the slow ceremony of choosing, the attendant's hand dipping in, and the magic of holding something that cost almost nothing and tasted like the whole trip was worth it. And if penny candy was the child's ritual, peanuts and a Coca-Cola was the grown-ups. A combination so deeply Southern, it needed no explanation where it was understood and no amount of explaining where it wasn't. You bought a glass bottle of Coke from the cooler and a small bag of salted peanuts from the rack, tore the corner of the bag, and poured the peanuts straight into the bottle. The salt cut the sweetness. The carbonation fizzed around the nuts. You drank and chewed at the same time, tilting the bottle to catch the last few peanuts at the bottom, and the combination, salty, sweet, cold, crunchy, was unlike anything else. Nobody invented it. It just happened, passed along by watching, never written down. Farmers did it. Mechanics did it. Your grandfather did it every Saturday at the filling station without once calling it a recipe. The glass bottles are gone now, and the pour doesn't work with a plastic cap and a foil bag. The ritual died quiet, one old man at a time. In a few small-town stations, the kind with a screen door and a dog asleep on the porch, somebody was frying pork skins fresh in the back room. Not the bagged kind from the wire rack. These were raw pieces of hog skin dropped into a deep pot of hot lard until they curled and puffed and turned gold, pulled out with a slotted spoon, salted while the grease was still popping. You could smell them from the pumps. The crackling was louder than the bagged version, the flavor deeper, the texture somewhere between a chip and a cloud, crisp on the outside, airy and dissolving on the inside. The man frying them usually didn't work for the station. He was a neighbor with a cast-iron pot and a hog he'd slaughtered that week. He sold them in paper bags, $1 a scoop, and they were gone by noon. That kind of station barely exists anymore. The man with the cast-iron pot is gone. The dog is gone. The screen door is gone. What's left is a fluorescent box selling the same bags you can get anywhere. Some stations in Appalachia and the Deep South kept a warming box near the coffee. Not a full kitchen, just a glass case with a light bulb inside. And if you stopped early enough, there might be squares of Cracklin Cornbread wrapped in wax paper, still warm from somebody's oven that morning. Cracklins were the crispy bits left over after rendering lard from pork fat. Crunchy, salty, rich. And when you stirred them into cornbread batter and baked it in a cast-iron skillet, the bread came out dense and golden with pockets of pork scattered through every bite. The recipe was old as the region, passed from mother to daughter without a measuring cup in sight. You poured until the batter looked right. That cornbread showed up in gas stations because the women who made it lived nearby, and the owner knew to ask. When those women stopped baking, when the daughters moved to cities and the stations changed hands, the warming box went dark. The Little Debbie rack was bolted low on the wall, eye level for a child, and that was no accident. McKee Foods out of Collegedale, Tennessee, had been making snack cakes since the early 1960s, named for the founder's granddaughter, the girl on every box. And the oatmeal creme pie was the quiet king of the lineup. 2 soft oatmeal cookies held together by a stripe of vanilla cream, wrapped in cellophane, sold for a dime. It wasn't flashy. It didn't crunch or snap or fizz. It was just sweet and soft and exactly the same every single time, which is what made it perfect for a kid sitting in the back of a station wagon on hour 6 of a drive that felt like it would never end. You peeled the wrapper slow to make it last. You ate the edges first, working your way to the center where the cream was thickest. Your grandmother kept a box in the pantry. She always had them, until the day she didn't, and nobody thought to buy more. In southern gas stations, the cookie jar on the counter wasn't decorative. It was inventory. Jack's cookies came individually wrapped, thick rounds of vanilla, chocolate, or coconut, sold for a few cents apiece from a glass canister by the register. Old-timers in Georgia and Alabama remember when 5 cost a nickel, back when the company ran routes through every filling station and country store between Columbus and Montgomery. The cookies were dense, dry in a way that held up to heat, and sweet enough to pass for dessert paired with a cold drink. The woman at the register knew which flavor you wanted before you asked. She'd been selling them to you since you were small enough to press your nose against the counter glass. Jack's never went national. They stayed regional, stayed small, stayed in the stations where people bought them one at a time with pocket change. When the big snack companies muscled onto the shelves, Jack slipped away, jar by jar, station by station, until the counter was bare. He knew your truck by the sound of the engine. Before you were out of the cab, the coffee was already poured. Styrofoam cup, black, no charge. That was how full-service stations worked in the 1970s. One man pumped your gas, cleaned your windshield, checked your oil, and handed you coffee while the pump still clicked. The coffee was terrible, burned, thin on the hot plate since dawn, and it was the best cup you ever had because it came with conversation. He knew your wife's name. He asked about the kids. He told you the road to Asheville was washed out and to take the long way. The coffee was free because the relationship wasn't transactional. You came back because he remembered you. Self-serve pumps killed that. Pay at the pump finished it. The stations got bigger, brighter, faster, and the man who knew your name got replaced by a screen asking if you wanted a receipt. The coffee costs $2 now. Nobody pours it for you. Golden Glow salad was another brightly colored creation that turned up at nearly every church gathering or family potluck. It was made with orange-flavored gelatin mixed with grated carrots and crushed pineapple, a combination that blended sweetness with a touch of vegetable crunch. Housewives would prepare it in large molds or pans and slice it into cubes or wedges, sometimes topping it with whipped cream or a creamy dressing. The bright orange color made it visually striking, earning its name as it seemed to glow under the lights of buffet tables. It was sweet enough that children loved it, but the carrots gave it the illusion of being healthy. Families considered it a salad even though it leaned more toward dessert, because gelatin salads were a category all their own in that decade. Golden Glow salad showed how creative cooks could get with inexpensive pantry items, turning 3 simple ingredients into a memorable side dish. Though it rarely appears today, its place in 1970s potluck culture was nearly guaranteed. Golden butterscotch pudding cake glowed like sunlight on a winter morning. When baked, it formed its own sauce, the top becoming soft sponge, while the bottom turned into molten butterscotch. The smell filled kitchens with the scent of caramel and butter, rich yet humble. It was the perfect dessert for cold evenings when family gathered close. Mothers made it in glass baking dishes, pouring hot water around the pan like a quiet ritual. The result was a dessert that looked plain, but tasted like magic. It was sweet without being showy, nostalgic even in its time. Kids would scrape their spoons to reach the warm pudding at the bottom, while parents savored the golden crust on top. It was food for togetherness, not meant for perfection, but for warmth. The 1970s made convenience king, yet this dish still demanded patience, and that was its secret charm. A single scoop brought comfort deeper than sugar could explain, a reminder that joy sometimes hides in the simplest of layers. Golden Glow salad was another brightly colored creation that turned up at nearly every church gathering or family potluck. It was made with orange-flavored gelatin mixed with grated carrots and crushed pineapple, a combination that blended sweetness with a touch of vegetable crunch. Housewives would prepare it in large molds or pans and slice it into cubes or wedges, sometimes topping it with whipped cream or a creamy dressing. The bright orange color made it visually striking, earning its name as it seemed to glow under the lights of buffet tables. It was sweet enough that children loved it, but the carrots gave it the illusion of being healthy. Families considered it a salad even though it leaned more toward dessert, because gelatin salads were a category all their own in that decade. Golden Glow salad showed how creative cooks could get with inexpensive pantry items, turning 3 simple ingredients into a memorable side dish. Though it rarely appears today, its place in 1970s potluck culture was nearly guaranteed. Grits and beans was a classic Southern pairing that balanced affordable, easy-to-grow corn grits with protein-packed cooked beans, making it a popular meal among low-income families in the 1970s. The dish was hearty and filling, providing energy and nourishment with simple ingredients that could be bought in bulk or grown in home gardens. Grits, often cooked creamy or slightly coarse, offered a comforting base, while beans added texture and flavor with minimal cost. This combination was flexible and adaptable, with variations depending on local bean varieties and seasoning preferences. It was a go-to meal that could be made vegetarian or with bits of pork for added richness when budgets allowed. Grits and beans reflected a culinary tradition rooted in resourcefulness and community, making it a staple on Southern tables during times of financial struggle. Its warmth and simplicity made it more than just food. It was a reminder of home and resilience. Prune whip mold was a dessert-like side dish that found its way onto many 1970s tables. Prunes were stewed until soft, whipped into a light puree, and folded with gelatin and whipped cream. The mixture was poured into molds and chilled until it set, creating a delicate, airy texture. The flavor was sweet yet mild, offering a way to enjoy fruit in a new and interesting form. It was often served in slices or scoops, sometimes topped with extra cream or nuts. Housewives relied on prune whip mold because it was easy to prepare, inexpensive, and could be made ahead of time for gatherings. It appealed especially to adults who appreciated its subtle sweetness and lightness after heavy main dishes. Prune whip mold carried the same charm as other gelatin-based recipes of the era, with the bonus of feeling wholesome thanks to the fruit base. Though it has nearly disappeared from menus today, it once held a firm place as a creative, thrifty, and surprisingly elegant dish for families and guests alike. One bite and the holidays felt close again. Simple, sincere, and sparkling. Orange cream gelatin parfaits were bright as morning light. Served in tall glass cups, they layered orange gelatin with creamy vanilla pudding, a playful mix of texture and color. The contrast made them as beautiful as they were refreshing. They tasted like dreamsicles turned elegant, each spoonful both cool and comforting. For 1970s hosts, they were a way to bring color and joy to the holiday table without breaking a sweat. Children loved the wobbly layers. Adults loved their nostalgic charm. Topped with a swirl of whipped cream and a slice of mandarin orange, they glistened like little suns on the table. The first taste was silky and citrus sweet, a small escape from the winter chill outside. Orange cream parfaits carried that balance the decade loved, playful yet polished, easy but never dull. They were desserts you could see before tasting, and somehow that made them taste even better. Every layer held light, laughter, and the brightness of simpler times. Lima bean supreme was a side dish that took a humble legume and dressed it up for special occasions. Lima beans were simmered until tender, then folded into a creamy sauce often flavored with butter, milk, and a touch of nutmeg. The mixture was poured into a baking dish, topped with breadcrumbs, and baked until golden and bubbling. It transformed the often overlooked lima bean into something rich and comforting, with a texture that appealed even to those who usually avoided them. Housewives appreciated it because it was economical, yet felt dressed up enough to bring to potlucks or serve at Sunday dinners. Children were coaxed into eating their vegetables when Lima bean supreme appeared because the creamy sauce softened the flavors and made it more approachable. It was one of those recipes that fit perfectly into the casserole culture of the 1970s, blending thrift with a little indulgence. Today it is hard to find, but it once stood as proof that even the plainest vegetables could be made into something memorable. Sloppy lentil sliders were a clever way to enjoy the sloppy Joe craze on a budget, swapping ground beef for lentils simmered in tangy tomato sauce. These mini patties were packed with flavor and nutrients, but cost a fraction of traditional meat sliders, making them a popular choice for families tightening their belts. Lentils provided a meaty texture that held together well when formed into small slider-sized patties, which were then topped with the signature sloppy Joe sauce. Served on small buns or even plain bread, these sliders brought joy to dinner tables without denting wallets. This dish embodied the spirit of 1970s thriftiness, taking a beloved classic and making it accessible to all income levels. The warm, tangy sauce paired perfectly with the hearty lentils, satisfying appetites and stretching meals further. It was a great way to introduce plant-based proteins before such ideas became mainstream, showcasing the timeless nature of creative, budget-friendly cooking. Celery crown salad was as much a visual piece as it was a food because the presentation mattered almost more than the taste. Housewives would take celery stalks, chill them until crisp, then fan them into the shape of a crown on a serving platter. The stalks would be held together with toothpicks or bands and then dressed with mayonnaise or a cheese-based sauce to add flavor. Sometimes pimentos or olives were added for color, turning the plain green into something more dramatic. It was refreshing, crunchy, and light, which made it a common sight on buffet tables crowded with heavier casseroles. The 1970s were a time when appearance at the table held value, and celery crown salad looked like something made with care even if it was simple to assemble. It offered a cool bite that balanced the richness of other dishes, and children often picked at it because of its playful shape. Though rarely made today, it once brought a sense of occasion to everyday celery. Old-fashioned Divinity candy shimmered like snow caught in sunlight. Whipped from egg whites, sugar syrup, and a whisper of vanilla, it demanded precision and patience. The process was an act of faith, beating, stirring, and waiting until the mixture turned cloud-like. In southern kitchens, it was made by grandmothers who knew just when the weather was dry enough for it to set. Divinity was delicate but proud, its texture melting on the tongue like spun sweetness. Each piece was dropped by the spoonful onto wax paper, crowned with a single pecan. It filled candy tins and mason jars, shared between neighbors as tokens of affection. Its white, glossy peaks seemed almost too perfect to eat, yet they were gone in moments. Making it was as much tradition as recipe, a quiet measure of love passed down through generations. Tomato aspic with shrimp garnish might be the ultimate example of how far gelatin molds could be pushed during the 1970s. Housewives would take tomato juice, mix it with unflavored gelatin, and let it set in ornate molds until it became a firm, jiggling centerpiece. On top of that shimmering red dome, cold shrimp would be arranged in neat patterns, often crowned with parsley for decoration. The dish was tangy, savory, and oddly refreshing, though the texture caught some people off guard. It was served cold as a side or appetizer, sometimes sliced into wedges like a cake. For potlucks and luncheons, tomato aspic stood out on the table because it looked unusual and sophisticated. It was the kind of dish that showed effort and creativity, even if guests approached it with caution. In an era that loved experimentation with molds, this savory gelatin became a conversation starter as much as a food. Though long gone from modern tables, it represents the quirky inventiveness of 1970s kitchens. Mock tuna salad made with mashed canned chickpeas gave families a vegetarian option that saved money while still feeling satisfying. By substituting expensive tuna with protein-packed chickpeas, people could whip up a creamy, flavorful salad using budget pantry staples like mayonnaise, celery, and a dash of mustard. This clever switch allowed folks to enjoy the familiar tang and texture of a tuna salad sandwich without reaching for costly canned fish. It was especially handy during the 1970s when canned goods were pantry mainstays and fresh ingredients were often hard to afford. The salad was versatile too, perfect served on bread, crackers, or simply eaten by the spoonful, making it a go-to for quick lunches or potluck dishes. The gentle, earthy flavor of the chickpeas paired well with the crunchy veggies, providing a satisfying bite every time. This dish stood as proof that a little creativity could turn humble ingredients into something special, and it brought smiles to many faces who craved something familiar but affordable. Lima bean supreme was a side dish that took a humble legume and dressed it up for special occasions. Lima beans were simmered until tender, then folded into a creamy sauce often flavored with butter, milk, and a touch of nutmeg. The mixture was poured into a baking dish, topped with breadcrumbs, and baked until golden and bubbling. It transformed the often overlooked lima bean into something rich and comforting, with a texture that appealed even to those who usually avoided them. Housewives appreciated it because it was economical, yet felt dressed up enough to bring to potlucks or serve at Sunday dinners. Children were coaxed into eating their vegetables when Lima bean supreme appeared because the creamy sauce softened the flavors and made it more approachable. It was one of those recipes that fit perfectly into the casserole culture of the 1970s, blending thrift with a little indulgence. Today it is hard to find, but it once stood as proof that even the plainest vegetables could be made into something memorable. Toasted marshmallow pie was a celebration of comfort and creativity. Every slice held the warmth of a winter fireplace, its top blanketed with perfectly browned marshmallows that melted into a golden crust. Underneath, a rich layer of chocolate filling waited, silky and sweet. It was a dessert born from campfire memories, reimagined for the suburban kitchen. Housewives of the 1970s loved its easy magic, a few simple ingredients transformed into something spectacular. Children gathered around ovens just to watch the marshmallows puff and brown, laughing when the sugar bubbled over the edge. Each slice felt like a hug, sticky and soft, a reminder that joy did not need to be complicated. This was a pie that belonged on every holiday table, a symbol of togetherness that looked as festive as it tasted. Long before gourmet took hold, toasted marshmallow pie proved that warmth could be baked, shared, and remembered. Today, it remains one of those desserts that never needed to grow up, the flavor of holidays where wonder was still simple. Mushroom rice pilaf was one of those dishes that showed just how much the 1970s leaned into casseroles as the answer for everything. Housewives would reach for canned mushrooms, pour them into rice, and simmer the whole thing with bouillon cubes until the flavor seeped through. Some would stop there and serve it straight from the stove, but the more popular approach was to pour it into a casserole dish and bake it until the top formed a crust. It was one of those meals that felt just fancy enough for a potluck without costing much or demanding complicated work. The canned mushrooms gave it that earthy taste, and when you added in the richness of broth, it seemed like something better than just plain rice. For families, it was filling and easy to reheat, which is why it showed up on dinner tables again and again. Mushroom rice pilaf sat quietly next to roasts or chicken, and sometimes it even became the star on its own. Today, it has mostly faded from memory, but back then it was a dependable comfort that everyone knew how to make. Pineapple meatballs were a popular 1970s dish that combined inexpensive ground meat with canned pineapple to add a sweet and tangy flavor, stretching limited protein further. The pineapple chunks softened the meatballs while infusing them with a unique twist that balanced savory and fruity notes. This recipe allowed families to enjoy a festive, flavorful meal without splurging on fancy ingredients. Typically baked or simmered in a simple sauce, these meatballs were served over rice or noodles, turning modest components into a filling dinner. The canned pineapple was often a pantry staple, prized for its long shelf life and ability to brighten up otherwise plain dishes. Pineapple meatballs became a fun and unexpected crowd pleaser at tables, embodying the spirit of 1970s home cooking where creativity met necessity. Its charm was in making the most of what was available while keeping meals exciting and tasty. Mushroom rice pilaf was one of those dishes that showed just how much the 1970s leaned into casseroles as the answer for everything. Housewives would reach for canned mushrooms, pour them into rice, and simmer the whole thing with bouillon cubes until the flavor seeped through. Some would stop there and serve it straight from the stove, but the more popular approach was to pour it into a casserole dish and bake it until the top formed a crust. It was one of those meals that felt just fancy enough for a potluck without costing much or demanding complicated work. The canned mushrooms gave it that earthy taste, and when you added in the richness of broth, it seemed like something better than just plain rice. For families, it was filling and easy to reheat, which is why it showed up on dinner tables again and again. Mushroom rice pilaf sat quietly next to roasts or chicken, and sometimes it even became the star on its own. Today, it has mostly faded from memory, but back then it was a dependable comfort that everyone knew how to make. Holiday Icebox Cheesecake was the no-bake miracle every hostess needed. It was cool, creamy, and made days ahead, saving precious oven space for roasts and pies. Cream cheese folded with whipped topping became velvet smooth, poured into crumbly cookie crusts pressed by hand. It was indulgent yet practical, the spirit of 1970s ingenuity. Cooks decorated the top with cherries or mandarin slices, sometimes tinted the filling pink for flair. It lived in the refrigerator until it was time to shine, chilled, firm, and flawless. Every slice was a balance of richness and lightness, of effort hidden behind ease. It became the signature dessert of potlucks and neighborhood gatherings, the one everyone asked for again. The first cool bite after a hearty meal felt like exhale, sweet, airy relief. Icebox Cheesecake was more than dessert. It was the taste of modern holiday convenience wrapped in nostalgia. It proved that even without baking, love could still set perfectly. Cheese soufflé casserole was a simplified take on the classic French soufflé adapted for the practicality of American households. Instead of fussing with delicate timing and perfect rises, housewives would prepare a cheesy egg mixture and bake it in a casserole dish until puffy and golden. It offered the look and taste of a soufflé without the stress of collapse, making it ideal for potlucks and family dinners. The dish carried a rich, savory flavor that paired well with salads, meats, or even just bread. It was hearty enough to act as a main dish, but usually played the role of a side, standing proudly among other casseroles of the era. For families who wanted to bring something impressive to gatherings, cheese soufflé casserole delivered both taste and reliability. Children liked its creamy texture, while adults appreciated the sense of European flair without complicated cooking. Though the soufflé name gave it elegance, the casserole format made it accessible to everyone. Today it is almost forgotten, but in the 1970s it was a proud showcase of ingenuity. Vegetable frittata with leftover veggies was a protein-packed casserole that rescued forgotten vegetables from the fridge, turning them into a hearty, affordable meal. Eggs, beaten and poured over diced carrots, peppers, onions, or greens, were baked until firm, creating a simple yet nourishing dish. This recipe was ideal for 1970s families who needed to make the most out of every grocery trip, using what was on hand rather than buying new ingredients. The frittata was filling enough to serve as a main dish and portable enough to be eaten cold for lunches or picnics. Its flexibility made it popular. Any combination of leftover vegetables could be tossed in without worrying about exact measurements. Baking the dish allowed the eggs to bind everything together, creating a warm, comforting meal that was easy on the wallet. Vegetable frittata highlighted the thrift and creativity of cooking during tough economic times while remaining delicious and satisfying. Cold beet borscht cups brought an unusual European influence into American kitchens of the 1970s. Beets were boiled, chilled, and pureed into a cold soup flavored with vinegar, dill, and sometimes sour cream. Instead of serving it in bowls, housewives poured it into small cups, offering it as a quirky side or appetizer. The vibrant magenta color made it striking, and its refreshing taste stood out at summer gatherings. While not everyone embraced its earthy flavor, those who did found it invigorating, especially when paired with bread or crackers. Cold beet borscht cups reflected the era's willingness to experiment with international dishes, even if they seemed unusual on American tables. They were considered refined in some circles, a nod to cosmopolitan tastes during a decade of culinary curiosity. For families, they offered variety and a sense of something different from the usual casseroles and gelatin salads. Today, they seem nearly forgotten, but they once represented the adventurous spirit of 1970s kitchens. Today, few take the time to make Divinity, but for those who remember, one bite recalls Christmas mornings, gentle voices, and sugar that seemed to hold light itself. Candy cane fudge bars brought holiday sparkle to every table. Chocolate fudge, soft and glossy, was spread thick in pans before being topped with crushed peppermint sticks. The colors, deep brown and bright red, looked like Christmas captured in candy. Each bite was a dance of cool mint and rich cocoa, bold yet balanced. Children helped press the candies on top, their fingers sticky with chocolate and joy. Mothers wrapped pieces in wax paper and tucked them into tins bound for neighbors and friends. The bars snapped cleanly, each one shining with little shards of peppermint glass. They were a gift that spoke of cheer and warmth without needing a card. In an era when everything was homemade and heart-driven, candy cane fudge bars stood out as both festive and effortless. They brought smiles to faces and sweetness to cold winter nights. Celery crown salad was as much a visual piece as it was a food because the presentation mattered almost more than the taste. Housewives would take celery stalks, chill them until crisp, then fan them into the shape of a crown on a serving platter. The stalks would be held together with toothpicks or bands and then dressed with mayonnaise or a cheese-based sauce to add flavor. Sometimes pimentos or olives were added for color, turning the plain green into something more dramatic. It was refreshing, crunchy, and light, which made it a common sight on buffet tables crowded with heavier casseroles. The 1970s were a time when appearance at the table held value, and celery crown salad looked like something made with care even if it was simple to assemble. It offered a cool bite that balanced the richness of other dishes, and children often picked at it because of its playful shape. Though rarely made today, it once brought a sense of occasion to everyday celery. Creamed spinach on toast was a simple way to enjoy greens without splurging on fresh produce or fancy sides. Spinach was cooked down into a silky, creamy sauce made from basic pantry ingredients like milk, butter, and flour, then spooned generously over slices of toasted bread for a meal that was both comforting and frugal. In the 1970s, when fresh vegetables could be expensive or scarce, this dish provided a way to sneak in some nutrition without fuss or cost. The creamy texture disguised the humble nature of the spinach, making it more appealing to picky eaters or anyone craving warmth on a chilly night. Serving it on toast also added a satisfying crunch and helped stretch the meal further. It was a favorite for those seeking comfort food that did not require elaborate preparation or exotic ingredients. This dish brought a touch of elegance to an otherwise simple ingredient and reminded many of home-cooked meals filled with warmth and love, even on the tightest budgets. Cheese soufflé casserole was a simplified take on the classic French soufflé, adapted for the practicality of American households. Instead of fussing with delicate timing and perfect rises, housewives would prepare a cheesy egg mixture and bake it in a casserole dish until puffy and golden. It offered the look and taste of a soufflé without the stress of collapse, making it ideal for potlucks and family dinners. The dish carried a rich, savory flavor that paired well with salads, meats, or even just bread. It was hearty enough to act as a main dish, but usually played the role of a side, standing proudly among other casseroles of the era. For families who wanted to bring something impressive to gatherings, cheese soufflé casserole delivered both taste and reliability. Children liked its creamy texture, while adults appreciated the sense of European flair without complicated cooking. Though the soufflé name gave it elegance, the casserole format made it accessible to everyone. Today it is almost forgotten, but in the 1970s it was a proud showcase of ingenuity. Caramel apple trifle turned the season's best flavors into a showpiece. Cubes of buttery pound cake were layered with spiced apples, caramel pudding, and whipped cream. Each layer glistened in clear glass bowls, a celebration of color and comfort. It was elegant enough for dinner parties, yet simple enough for home kitchens. The smell alone, cinnamon, brown sugar, butter, drew everyone closer. Every bite was soft and rich, the sweetness deepened by a hint of tart fruit. Families made it for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and every occasion in between. In a decade known for convenience, this dessert managed to feel special without being complicated. It captured the heart of 1970s gatherings, where beauty met practicality and tradition met innovation. Caramel apple trifle reminded everyone that celebration did not need excess, only intention. Served chilled, it tasted like the warmth of a family gathered together, layered, imperfect, and endlessly good. Prune whip mold was a dessert-like side dish that found its way onto many 1970s tables. Prunes were stewed until soft, whipped into a light puree, and folded with gelatin and whipped cream. The mixture was poured into molds and chilled until it set, creating a delicate, airy texture. The flavor was sweet yet mild, offering a way to enjoy fruit in a new and interesting form. It was often served in slices or scoops, sometimes topped with extra cream or nuts. Housewives relied on prune whip mold because it was easy to prepare, inexpensive, and could be made ahead of time for gatherings. It appealed especially to adults who appreciated its subtle sweetness and lightness after heavy main dishes. Prune whip mold carried the same charm as other gelatin-based recipes of the era, with the bonus of feeling wholesome thanks to the fruit base. Though it has nearly disappeared from menus today, it once held a firm place as a creative, thrifty, and surprisingly elegant dish for families and guests alike. Egg Foo Young in the Americanized style was a go-to meal for families looking for a quick and hearty dish without breaking the budget. This simple egg omelet is packed with whatever vegetables you had on hand, like bean sprouts, onions, and peas, all fried together and smothered in a savory brown sauce made from pantry staples. Unlike the traditional Chinese version, this recipe uses a more approachable flavor profile for American palates, making it a nostalgic reminder of 1970s takeout nights. It stretched a few eggs into a meal that felt like a treat and was easy enough to whip up on any weeknight. Plus, it made leftovers taste like new again the next day, proving that clever cooking was the real secret to surviving tight budgets. Whether it was served with rice or alone, Egg Foo Young was a simple way to bring something a little different to the dinner table without spending much. The mix of fluffy eggs and crisp veggies gave families a comforting, filling dish that was perfect for when money was tight, but taste still mattered. Those stations went quiet, and the hands that filled the cup stopped reaching. If one of these brought somebody back, tell us which one.